Okay. Uh, my name is Avi. I have stroke, so it's hard to communicate. But David, not David.
That's
uh,
okay.
uh, Paul, right? Paul? I don't know. He is deaf, so I want to speak with you, about deaf and other stuff.
Yeah,
Okay. So what's going on
yeah. Where would you like to start?
right now?
No, I mean, in terms of my story or just about deafness in general.
First, your story. Yeah.
Okay. So I have Usher syndrome type 2, which is defined by usually the person will go deaf before the age of 5. And then later in their late teens, young 20s or so, they start to experience symptoms of night blindness and then eventually find out that they are going blind. And it's a condition that results in deaf blindness. There's no treatment or cures currently for the disease. And it affects about 25 to 50,000 people in the US and less than 200,000 people in the world. Excuse me. And so the deafness component for me, I've been dealing with ever since I was 5 years old. So as we talk about the whole topic of deafness, um, in the bigger picture, it's probably important for people to know that it's the number three most common health condition in the world. And most people find that to be quite surprising. After heart disease and cancer, we all universally face hearing loss to some degree. Doesn't necessarily mean people are deaf, but hearing loss is a known medical condition that affects people in a lot of different ways. So when we talk about hearing loss, there's tremendous diversity within the people that face it, but there's also a lot of stereotypes around hearing loss. So stereotypes of hearing loss would be that you would have to be very old, that you might not be so smart, you could be dumb, or that you're just very difficult to communicate with. And those are the stereotypes that are out there, but that's not universally the case. Things that we know about hearing loss is that the average person tends to go about 10 years before they start to seek a solution for their hearing loss if it starts to become a significant impediment. And what's important about that is that this research or the science is finding out that untreated hearing loss is actually accelerating the aging process. So as a result, the brain is trying to compensate and it's trying to do things. And the person that has hearing loss is generally the biggest obstacle to their moving forward. Because one of the most interesting things about hearing loss is that hearing loss is probably one of the more treatable forms of medical condition of any condition other than the ones that I've talked about. It's hard to reverse heart disease, it's hard to stop cancer. But with hearing loss, we can intervene at different points in people's lives to either enhance the quality of their life or to make them healthy. So it's the biggest thing is that there's a lot of stigmas with that to getting hearing aids or any intervention. So people just tend to be the biggest obstacle to their own selves to getting treatment. So hearing loss has a number of different components to it. The other thing that most people focus on with hearing loss is that it's all about volume. And that's one of those other stereotype things that if you come across a person with hearing loss, is that if you just yell and scream at them louder, they'll get the message. And that's not true. That usually generally results in them becoming much more agitated. In some cases, get threatened or angry because the louder you yell at somebody, the more people think you're mad at them or that you're doing something wrong. So probably the number one worst thing to do to a person with hearing loss is to yell at them. It also makes them feel, self-esteem, makes them feel bad because they're not necessarily trying to get in the way of the communication, but there's just all this emotional component to go with it. So for hearing loss, one of the biggest things is that most people do realize is that it does isolate you to some degree. Um, and so as a result, some people start to lose interest in conversations. They tend to be more with shy or withdrawn and don't initiate conversation. Or they'll be very compliant and shake their head a lot and nod as if they're going along with it, but they have no idea what's going on. So the social component and connection to other people is a very psychologically distressing thing for a person with hearing loss. And the more severe the hearing loss, the more severe that psychological stress can be. So it's important a lot of times to understand with people with hearing loss is how do you get their attention? And the way to get their attention is to use your hand to point, to draw attention to yourself. And sometimes it's talking a little bit more slowly because they can read lips and they can start to figure out what might be going on. Or in some cases, just a gentle, and I mean gentle, touch to get their attention, to have them turn around and focus toward you. Because if you're talking behind them, they have no idea you're talking to them. But if you touch too fast or too hard, you can scare them and startle them. So it's important that they know why you're touching them or what you're trying to do. You want to be in a welcoming and an open stance with them. In other words, rather than yelling louder and getting tenser, smiling is probably one of the bigger things that you can do. Because a kind face is a face that draws people to you, rather than an angry face, which tends to push people away. So those are just some of those simple little, kind of cues that happen with people with the hearing loss. But there's tremendous diversity within the hearing loss community. So, we have people that just have mild hearing loss. Anybody who's 40 or 50 years old has lost some of their frequencies just due to aging that they had in their 20s. And the most common thing that people notice with that are sometimes the sounds that they hear with music. They say, oh, I used to be able to hear that sound and I don't hear it anymore. Like a child will hear a sound different and an adult says, oh, I don't hear that. A dog whistle can be a good example of that. But more commonly, when it starts to impact some of the other areas of communication and enjoyment of things, that's when you know you have hearing loss. So I talked about this a little bit about how people think it's about volume, but hearing loss affects many different aspects of your senses that people don't think about. So from one of them is that even if you were to talk louder for someone to hear it, maybe it's not clear. So if you want to think like, for example, if you had an electrical signal that was going and all of a sudden there was a surge and there's noise in the electricity, the same thing happens with hearing. Is that if you can't get a clear signal, it doesn't matter how loud someone screams at you, if you can't tell the difference between the letter A and the letter C or the letter F and the letter V, you have this inability. We call that discrimination. You just don't have the ability to discern the differences in the letters to discern what the word is that's being said. So, clarity and discrimination is another important component of hearing. You could have all the power in the world going into your hearing aid, but if you have a bad signal that can't send it clearly to your brain, you're just making a very bad transmission very loud and very bad, which only creates a worse problem. So that's one of the other elements people don't think about. The other thing with hearing loss is about spatial orientation. So when you're looking directly at someone, it's easier to maybe pick up with some of your other senses like your eyes and things about what's going on or the direction of a sound. But a lot of times, if you're walking down the street in Manhattan in New York City, you've got buses, you've got taxis, you've got cars that are pushing the horns, you've got the light signals going on, you got people yelling, you got screaming, you got street vendors, you've got the subway going, and then you've got the water going through. And so all of a sudden rain comes down and then there's a storm. And then there's all kinds of modern city noises that start to get in the way. So as a result, you don't know where that sound came from. Was it in front of you? Was it in back of you? Was it to the side of you? And so that person that's trying to tell you, excuse me, and get around you, you never heard them. And all of a sudden you feel this shove, and then you wonder why they pushed you around. And the person thinks, well, that person wasn't paying attention to me. But in many cases, that person just never heard you either. So spatial orientation is a very important thing for sound, knowing where sound comes from, and then going toward the sound or away from the sound means certain things for you.
Very
The
interesting.
other thing is, yeah, it is. The other one is safety and security is associated with sound. So you're taking that going across the crosswalk, and the car lays on his horn as he's coming around and about ready to hit you as a pedestrian. That's a signal you're in trouble. And so fear and safety is a very important, and that's why some of the sounds that we have alert us to security, and some sounds alert us to fear. So the sound of a running river is calming, but the sound of a siren of an ambulance or a tornado warning tells you you need to seek cover and do something immediately. So that's another component of sound that becomes very important. But probably one of the bigger ones that really doesn't get discussed, and probably is one of the biggest reasons for isolation for people or the feeling of being left out, is the emotional consequences of sound. And as I talked about early when we were just having this conversation, yelling louder at a person doesn't help. What happens is a person with hearing loss can't tell sometimes whether you're really happy or whether you're really angry. Because if they don't hear it, they just see the face almost doing the same thing. And so they have a hard time discerning tones in people's voices. That sounded like a happy person today. That sounded like a mean person today. That sounded like an angry person today. That sounds like a very sad person today. So in conversation, they have a hard time sometimes picking up the social cues that are being conveyed by voice, which is things of like joy, happiness, sadness, and those types of things. And so sometimes people with hearing loss just, for lack of a better description, net it out. They just say it, but it doesn't have an emotional component to it because they don't feel the emotion sometimes in voice or in their voice or another person's voice. They're just simply talking. So sometimes people will say, well, it feels a little robotic or unemotional because it just basically their brain is not hearing and interpreting and feeling those emotions the same way as a person who's sending those to another person. And so there's that classic line that people talk about, which is, I really didn't get a good vibe from that person. Deaf people can pick up in a minute the people they don't get a good vibe from. And it's intuitive, it's instinctual that we all have that within us. So those are the many different components of why hearing loss can be such a difficult thing for people, because life is 24/7. You get up and you go all the way till you go to bed at night, and everything is a series of different interactions, of which sound is an important component. And we all crave connection, but if you live in a silent, quiet, and controlled world with an inability to connect backwards the same way as everyone around you can, it just becomes very tiring. So it's very common for people with hearing loss and stuff to probably get very tired by the time the end of the day comes around, because they're using their other senses to keep up, process, and try and use the brain in different ways to understand what's going on. So the mental and physical tiredness is not an unusual component for people with hearing loss. Which kind of gets into, what are some of the things they can do, right? So
Yeah.
the diversity of the group is wide, but there's different ways that people can go at it. So for people we have a scale that we go by for mild hearing loss to moderate hearing loss. Then there's severe hearing loss. Then there's profound hearing loss. And beyond that, basically, you can't hear. So there's a little bit to no sound at all.
And what
If
about,
you're in the yeah, go ahead.
what about you? What are you, the deaf?
So I'm on the bubble of severe to profound. So I'm helped by technology. I couldn't hear without technology, but the level of technology that I can use, I still have a couple options left before I would have, I'm still using what I have left of my residual hearing without having to go fully electronic. We'll talk about that.
Okay, good.
So if you have the mild loss, the first thing that a lot of people start to do is they just simply focus on being in a quieter situation. They will avoid parties, background. They will do more one-on-one, just getting closer to people and ask people to repeat. A number of people just intuitively learn to read people's lips.
Yeah.
They can kind of, oh, okay. And one of the interesting things about the brain is the brain actually goes, you can think 3 to 5 times faster than you hear. So sometimes people with hearing loss do what we call fake it till you make it. And what that is you let the person go through an entire sentence or two, and you maybe get 30-40% of what they said, and then you fill in the blanks yourself, and you're trying to guess what the person's saying. So you may not hear every word, but you're stringing enough words together. You're using your brain and the speed of your brain to put it together. And a lot of times you're dead on. You're pretty accurate. And in some cases you are absolutely dead wrong. And the more times you're dead wrong, the more you're realizing that your hearing loss is really pretty bad, and that you're not gonna make it for much longer. Because for some people, hearing loss is progressive over their lifetime, and for other people, hearing loss is from birth or through a sudden accident, or some cases people get a vaccination or something went bad, whatever. But so as a result, that's one of the tests of figuring out where you are in the hearing loss spectrum. Once that doesn't work anymore, then you have to start looking at technology intervention. So as you start to go from moderate loss to severe loss, you have to figure out, well, what are my options? So your options then start to be what a lot of people know as hearing aids. And hearing aids basically are devices worn in the outside of your ear. And then that will help with the amplification of sound we talked about. It can help with the clarity of sound. It's like a computer chip. It brings a better signal, a clear signal to help you hear better. And so as a result, it helps you with getting through those situations. But the downsides of the hearing technology are that they typically aren't covered by insurance. They're very expensive to get. And as a result, not as many people have them for that reason. The other thing is that while they help you better on one-on-one situations, they're not perfect for group settings, party settings, and those types of things. To go into a bar with hearing aids sometimes, can still be very confusing, wild and crazy, and kind of hard to hear people. But it does move you in the direction of doing better, at work or on the telephone, or talking or listening to music and doing some of those daily activities. So the hearing aids are kind of the first, thing you can start to do from a technology perspective. Then what people start to pursue is if it really becomes more where you're at with me, you can't get a hearing aid big enough, and you can't get a computer powerful enough to stick it on your ear. So as a result, the hearing loss is that some people have to start to make the decision or determination as to whether or not they want to have some residual hearing. And if that hearing is going to be hearing other than their own, meaning this is where we start to talk about people no longer can benefit from a hearing aid, they can benefit from a cochlear implant. But with a cochlear implant, what we're essentially doing is we go in and go into the brain and have a brain surgery. And then they take out your existing hearing system, and then they put a computer processor in there. They wire it to the brain, they seal the brain back up, and then they have a magnet and a receiver on the outside. And now what we do is we then take the person through a many month long rehabilitation process to heal, and then also then start to learn how to speak again, because the brain will now be taught how to reconfigure itself to learn a new language. And that language is going to be coming from the electronics, and people have to literally learn to hear again, speak again, and come out of that experience. A cochlear implant will never replace 100% of natural hearing.
Of course.
But it will provide a lot of the experiences that you would normally have in a person's life that they couldn't get with the hearing aid. And if not complete silence, that you would imagine was complete deafness. So then there's also a whole culture and population of people that have had genetic hearing loss in families or randomly through their family tree that believe and have a desire that they were designed to be deaf. They embrace being deaf. They don't want to have hearing technology intervention. They don't believe that surgery is what is necessary. And so, as you know, there's a whole deaf population out there that boldly and proudly embraces the natural state of the condition that they live in and don't think that technology intervention is a solution. So for that population of those are the most commonly ones that you think of where they go through their school experience, they might go to Gallaudet University, they may live in homes or communities of purely other deaf people, and they have their own ways of living within what we call a deaf culture. And that deaf culture also is highly, one of the most common things that they will do is sign language.
Right.
So sign language also becomes one of the other assistive technologies that are out there, which people don't think about it, but it's an assistive language technology that allows people to communicate that if you can't hear, we can still communicate. And so as a result, we do that through sign language. So there are people that do sign language for, hearing aids, with hearing aids. Some people do sign language with cochlear implants, and some people do sign language with no technology intervention. So sign language has emerged in the last 25 years or so to be an alternative communication assistive technology that a lot of people are becoming much more aware of. And so the interesting thing about the history of sign language is that it was kind of a fringe thing, and it wasn't really that well known. But with the Americans with Disabilities Act in the last 25 years or so, it's raised the profile of it. But probably the single biggest thing that allowed sign language to catch on was that there were a number of students that were in mainstream in schools all across America that were taking English, French, German, Spanish, and all of those languages. But with hearing loss, they were also failing those languages and taking those courses because they couldn't hear, much less communicate the language they were being taught. And so sign language was then the United Nations and some other groups got together and declared that sign language was a bona fide human language and that all human beings were entitled to the right to be able to communicate. So what happened was that there was a generation of students that now could go to high school, and even if they didn't have hearing loss or not, they could take sign language as their foreign language option, which would then allow them to get into college and show that they had a foreign language proficiency. So the mainstreaming of American Sign Language has done a lot to help raise the awareness of sign language as an option for anyone, whether they're hearing or not, but it also made it attractive for people with hearing to engage with people who could not hear in new ways because they had learned the language that they both had learned. So it's been a very positive social development is that sign language now, whenever you see like a lot of the coronavirus stuff right now, all the briefings that you see the governors do, there's a sign language person in the background there, and it's now mandated and it's something that is expected, and it's a great resource for people. And that, along with closed captioning, as another assistive technology on TV, allows people to try and keep track of what's going on because in a lot of cases, if you can't see the person's face, but there's two people in the movie talking back and forth, you have no idea what one half of the conversation's about. So the whole closed captioning thing is another way to help people understand what's going on.
After the stroke, also captioning. Love captioning. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And as a stroke, you probably experienced this too. The other thing is, because I know we had this conversation about, EMTs and medical intervention and how do you work with people with hearing loss and things like that. Is if a person is calm, but you're having trouble communicating, but you want to get the conversation going, One of the great things is to have a dry erase board. You know, with stroke people, we do that early on. Write the question down on a whiteboard and wait for the answer to come back, and the person will then respond backwards. And so that's another great one beyond touch and talking slowly and having a warm, open face is trying to find out the method that seems to be the best way for them to communicate. And sometimes just directly asking that question of a person, if you do know they're hearing impaired, you can say, what is the best and most preferred way for you to communicate with others? And that will usually lead to some things that you can do. Um, so that's the interesting thing about hearing loss is that everybody's impacted at some degree at some point in their life. Depending on when and how it happened has a lot to do with how they use these technologies, what these technologies can do, and then what their life experiences are determines a lot about how they react in the world and whether they feel understood or have the ability to be communicated to, and then also communicate with other people.
Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Wow.
Yeah,
It's it's very complex. Hearing loss is,
yeah,
yeah. Very interesting.
yeah. But in some ways it is, and then in other ways it's not, because it's like on one human level, we all know we want to be understood, and then we all want to be able to communicate what it is that's going on with us. And
Right.
sometimes the most basic way to address it is to be welcoming, non-threatening, ask questions, ask them how you can help them,
Right.
rather than try and drive the urgency of the situation to get what you need out of it. Realizing that it's hard for that person to get it out to you. So sometimes it's like taking 2 or 3 keys to a door and finding the right key to get in. One person is sign language, another person is the whiteboard, another person is talking louder, another one is, is they need some hearing technology. So
And I was wondering, in USA is American uh, deaf. What about England or Germany or whatever? Is the same speaking or different speaking?
um, well, everybody has the language that they have in their country that they come from.
Mhm.
So with hearing loss, they're going to face the same basic challenges, which is either it's not loud enough, it's not clear enough, or I don't feel safe, or I don't have the ability to connect with the people in my community. The factor that gets in the way of that is also pretty universal. You know, um, you were born with the loss and you're deaf and you're coming up with a plan, or you are had an accident, something happened, or you may be elderly. And so what's interesting is that everybody seems to have a lot of the same experiences, but every country seems to have a very different level of awareness and education within their culture as to what the options are available to them and how you can make it possible for people that have hearing loss to have a rich and fulfilling life.
Okay.
So, for example, I took a group of teenagers to Peru, and they were mostly cochlear implant, American Sign Language. We were going down there to experience Peru, but these kids had no idea. On one hand, they thought they were going on a great spring trip to Peru and share their experiences that those kids in Peru would have had the same experience that they had as deaf kids. But what happened was we went to visit them and they found a very different world for a deaf person. So,
Really?
for example, in Peru, what happened was is that the average person in Peru um, stopped going to school by about the age of 11 or 12, and that's because they can't make the hurdle past first grade. And
Really?
what's happened is that the school system in Peru does not make provision for deaf people being any different than a normal student. So these students go into regular school with a regular teacher. They can't hear and they can't keep up and they keep flunking. And the teachers are not trained to know anything about hearing loss, what they can do to help or to intervene. The average family income improves about $750 a year. And what happens is because of the poverty cycles, that if you have multiple children and everybody's earning money, anybody with a physical challenge beyond even deafness tends to be left on the side in the margins of society in Peru. So what happens then is that we were meeting kids that were actually living on the streets in Peru because their family couldn't do anything for them and didn't want to do anything because they were perceived as liability. So they were put out on the street. So these kids were going thinking they're going to talk about their cochlear implants, what it was like to go through a school experience and all of that, only to find out that in Peru, basically by the age of 14 or so, there was a huge significant portion of women that would become prostitutes and living on the street. And that a lot of young men that were deaf in Peru would die before the age of 30 because of drugs and alcoholism and trying to survive on the street because
Wow.
they couldn't hold a job, they couldn't communicate with anyone, and they had no education. So after we visited a few of these places, the American kids were realizing they had a totally different experience as it related to deaf culture and the technology interventions. So they weren't entitled to education in Peru. They weren't giving any medical treatment. There was no awareness and treatment option. And as a result, they were seen as a drag on the society, and they didn't have the ability to meet their need. And so it's a very sad story, between cultures, but the living experiences are the same. They're just struggling the same way as any other hearing person in the world. It's just that Peru doesn't have the same level of resources or capability to help them get to where they need to go.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So the chances are the more advanced the economy or the country in the world, the more likely they will know that these options are available and there's a way they could potentially get them.
Mhm.
But the more challenges that a country has as more of a first world country, it's really hard for people to overcome these barriers. But to have it be the third most common health condition in the world just goes to show you what the implications are, both from an economic and psychological and society and life expectancy standpoint. Because hearing loss in some countries can be a very life-limiting blow.
Wow. That's, again, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Wow.
Mhm.
Okay. That's, yeah.
Good. That help?
Yeah.
Anything else?
No. And unfortunately, the Zoom is 40 minutes. So,
Yeah.
um,
Good.
thank you so much. Really, it's fascinating. And thank you for the professionals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and part of my talking about it is I've obviously have talked about this before. I've been an ambassador for Hear the World.
Oh,
Hear
really?
the World is based in Switzerland, which is the world's largest organization dedicated to hearing loss and getting the word out and understanding what it means, across cultures and things like that. So I do encourage people to go to places like the Hearing Loss Association of America. It's the #1 organization to learn about hearing loss.
Where is that?
And it's based in Bethesda, Maryland, and it sometimes goes by the acronym HLAA, Hearing Loss Association of America.
Okay.
So that is a great organization for people to find out from an American perspective what's out there. On a global perspective, Hear the World is a great advocate to understanding what goes on with hearing loss on a global level and all the work that people are doing to try and do it, to address it and to help people get the resources they need.
Okay. Again, thank you so much. Really, really. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm good. Well, have a great Christmas too, okay?
Thank you very much. Happy holiday is you too as well.
Yeah, we're talking the new year, okay?
Take care.
Okay, see ya.